Well, hello and welcome back to our videos on the human digestive system. I want to start off this video with a really gross story. Now, who says science needs to be clean, sterilized, and carried out in a lab? For you see, back very long ago, there was a man with a hole in his stomach. And that man's name was Alexis St. Martin. You see, Alexis St. Martin was very unfortunate, because as he was going out one day, he was shot very near his stomach, very near his chest, right here, and it left a hole in his stomach. Yes, the bullet went through his stomach and left a hole. There was a hole that you could actually put your finger in, and you could literally feel the inside of his stomach. What a poor man Alexis St. Martin was. Now, come along this scientist, this man named Beaumont. Beaumont saw Alexis St. Martin, and instantly he fell in love with him. Well, not that kind of love, what are you thinking about? No, he fell in love with him because he thought, wow, a man with his stomach, I can carry out some interesting experiments with him. Such is the thinking of scientists. Not always the most compassionate of people, but sometimes a bit carried away by their own ideas. So what Beaumont did, he decided he would do some experiments with Alexis St. Martin. So he tied some 1/4 ounce pieces of food to the end of a silk string. And he dangled food through the hole in St. Martin's stomach. So what you see here is a little hole. And here is St. Martin actually extracting some of the digestive fluids out from St. Martin's stomach. Sorry, I meant Beaumont trying to extract some of the fluid out of his stomach. And he would tie pieces of food on a piece of string and dip it into his stomach and see what the effect of that was. Just to try to figure out what the stomach was doing in digestion. So that was what science was like in the past. Not the most ethical, but it was all in the name of curiosity and discovery. Now please don't do such things with one another, alright? It's not really acceptable nowadays. So what exactly does the stomach do in digestion? Well, that's the main point, and thankfully we have figured out more and more things as time has gone by, and here's what we know about the stomach. So when we look at the stomach, what do you notice about its structure? Well, the first thing you'll notice is that it is kind of like a bag, except it's not like any plastic bag. It is a muscular bag, right? A bag that has muscles in the wall of the bag. And the stomach is a muscular bag for a reason, for it's related to its function. So what does the stomach do? When you look at this picture, hopefully you remember I mentioned it earlier in last week. Well, the stomach contracts and relaxes. It actually carries out peristalsis. Right? The stomach also has peristalsis, but the function here is not so much to move the food along, but to churn the food. So the key word here is churn. So the stomach contracts and relaxes to churn the food. Right? And in doing this, in churning the food, it actually breaks the food down from bigger pieces to smaller pieces. Now, is this a form of physical or chemical digestion? Well, the answer is it is physical digestion. And again, it is to increase the surface area for enzymes to act on. So in the stomach, we have physical digestion going on through churning. Now, if you look at the inside of the stomach wall, what you will notice is it has many pits. Alright? Pits. In fact, they're called gastric pits. Right? The stomach wall is not flat, right? It's not just a flat wall. It actually has many ins and outs and ins and outs. It forms gastric pits. Right? And these gastric pits contain gastric glands. Now, what do these gastric glands do? That's the structure. What do these glands do? Well, it turns out they produce a kind of juice called gastric juice. And gastric juice contains 3 different components. Well, the first thing is that it contains protease, which hopefully rings a bell in your head. Protease is an enzyme. Alright, we'll talk about it in just a while. It also contains acid, hydrochloric acid. Wow. And finally, it contains mucus. Well, not exactly the same stuff that comes out of your nose when you're sick, but it does contain mucus. Alright, so these are the 3 components of gastric juice, and we'll see what it does in just a while. So firstly, what does the protease do? Well, if you remember, protease is an enzyme, and it breaks down protein to polypeptides, alright, or smaller proteins. And this is a form of chemical digestion. Remember the diagram that you saw in your earlier set of notes. Protein is being broken down chemically into polypeptides or smaller proteins. This is a chemical digestion because there's a change in substance and there are enzymes involved. Well, next, do you know that your stomach contains acid? You know, hydrochloric acid, when you look at it, there's some in the lab. I don't think those come from your stomach. But it's quite interesting that your stomach contains acid. Now, have you ever had that experience when you burp, right? Burp. Okay, sorry, not so loud. Burp. And you feel that there's a little burning feeling in your esophagus. Have you felt that before? In your throat? Well, what's happening is that sometimes when you burp, some of the gastric juice that contains acid goes up your esophagus and you get that sensation. And it's called heartburn. Except that it's not your heart being burnt, actually. It's just your esophagus getting a bit of that acid feeling on it. Now, since it's somewhat interesting that your stomach has hydrochloric acid, what does that acid do? What's its function? Firstly, it is there to activate protease. Remember, protease is the enzyme. Now, it turns out this enzyme needs an acidic environment to work. So, hydrochloric acid helps to activate it and make it work, and make it break down proteins to polypeptides. Now, secondly, hydrochloric acid kills bacteria. So, you eat food with dirty hands, and the food has so much bacteria on it, and when you eat, it goes to your stomach. The acid helps to kill the bacteria and keep you safe. So, it's a form of defense as well. And finally, hydrochloric acid also stops salivary amylase from working. Now, if you remember, salivary amylase came from your mouth and it was working to break down starch to maltose. Now, it turns out salivary amylase doesn't really work well in an acidic environment, right? Protease here works well in an acidic environment, but salivary amylase does not. So, the stomach's acid also helps to stop the salivary amylase from working. Alright, that's one of the effects of it. Now, some of you might be wondering then, why doesn't the stomach digest itself? I mean, it has all this acid and enzymes in it. Why doesn't it digest itself? And the answer lies in the mucus. But because the mucus actually forms a protective lining in the stomach, which protects it from digesting itself. Alright, so let's summarize the stomach. Now, we've seen that in the stomach we have physical digestion. Alright, physical digestion in the form of churning, right? The churning of food. But we also saw that we have chemical digestion, right? Due to the enzyme protease. And there is chemical digestion of proteins being broken down to polypeptides. Now, notice that in the stomach, there is no chemical digestion of carbohydrate, so no carbohydrate chemical digestion, right? Starch doesn't get broken down in the stomach, it was broken down in the mouth. And there is also no chemical digestion of fat. Okay, so only protein. Now let's end off with some questions. Firstly, true or false, salivary amylase breaks down starch into glucose in the mouth. The answer is false. It does not break down starch to glucose directly. This is a very tricky question Okay, it breaks down starch into maltose. So this is a common trick question. Secondly, peristalsis only happens in the esophagus. This answer is also false. Peristalsis happens throughout the alimentary canal, right? For example, peristalsis in the stomach results in churning. Finally, chemical digestion of protein starts and ends in the stomach. Is this true or false? And the answer is false. Right, chemical digestion of protein starts in the stomach, right? Because in the stomach there's protease, and we saw that protease breaks down protein to polypeptides, right? So this is the start of protein chemical digestion. However, can you see that we are still at the level of polypeptides? These need to still be broken down into amino acids. So that hasn't happened in the stomach yet. So chemical digestion of protein starts in the stomach, but it doesn't end in the stomach. We still need to break down polypeptides into amino acids. So let's take a bit of stock before we end up. What kind of chemical digestion have we seen so far? Now we've looked at the mouth and the stomach so far, right? And we've also looked at these three main groups of nutrients: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. In the mouth, there was chemical digestion of which one? Carbohydrates. Right, we saw that starch was broken down to maltose by amylase, right? Salivary amylase, the enzyme. Right, there was no chemical digestion of proteins or fats. Now in the stomach, we saw that there was chemical digestion, but not of carbohydrates, but of proteins, right? Because there was protease, we saw that in the stomach, protein is broken down to polypeptides. Right? And there was no chemical digestion of fat. Right, in our next video, and going on, we're going to be looking at the small intestine. And what we will see is that in the small intestine, right, there's going to be digestion of all three, right? Carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Right, and we're going to see that in the small intestine, digestion is completed. So here, starch is broken down to maltose, but maltose still needs to be broken down to glucose. Here, proteins are broken down to polypeptides, but polypeptides still need to be broken down to amino acids. Alright, so all this happens in the small intestine, and that is where digestion is completed. Okay, so hold that thought, and we'll come back to it again when we see each other. Alright, see you.